the welcome process now?
Yes, please.
Fantastic. So, hi everybody, I am Rachel Gillette, and together with Frank and Ozan and Remco and Matthijs and Sureka and many colleagues in the Decolonisation Research Group, we have organized this Unsettling Knowledge Seminar. But I have to say that a great deal of the credit goes to Frank and to Jansu, our fantastic intern, who have really rescheduled this after the many, many difficulties of last year and turned it into a wonderful and inviting and globally open series of online events. So we are, as I said, the Decolonisation Research Group, funded by UGlobe and supported by the History Department, but very much Utrecht-wide and the Netherlands-wide in terms of our intellectual network. The Decolonisation Research Group studies both decolonisation as a historic time period and set of developments and events, but also we look at decolonial praxis and practice and theory. And we focus on both teaching and knowledge production, and we bring that to our work. So this series obviously fits into that. Some of our mission aims are to bring decolonial approaches and knowledge to the Netherlands, and we join a fantastic set of people in the Netherlands already doing that, like Rolando Vasquez-Melken and many others, too many to name. But we also seek to bring scholarship to the Netherlands and to a broader community to amplify the voice of scholars of color, women scholars, scholars who aren't as represented as they could be in the academic community, and to work in community and solidarity with each other. And so these are some of our aims as a research group. And in this nature, I will throw to my colleague and community member, Frank, who will then pass us on to Ozan. Welcome, everybody.
Yes. So welcome. This is our first meeting in the Unsettling Knowledge Seminar series, which seeks to explore how knowledge, how we interpret what this might become, with the potential. We try to engage this in a very critical way.
Frank, just so you know, you're dropping out for me. I don't know if you're dropping out for anybody else, but you're dropping out for everyone, actually.
Okay. Well, then...
That we had a poor connection, actually.
And Frank, it looks like you're frozen. So just in the interests of time, and I'm really sorry, can I throw to Ozan to introduce Isa? Yeah, okay. And
yes.
I'll just recap what Frank was going to say, which is that this is the first in a really fascinating series of events. And he might say more about that at the end before we moderate the question and answer. Let's hope the connection comes back in. Ozan Ozavci, I could say many things about your scholarship and your friendship as well, but I will leave it to you to introduce Isa.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. I would like to begin by wishing everyone a good afternoon and thank the audience one more time on behalf of the Decolonisation Group at Utrecht University for your interest in our seminar. I'm very happy that we could finally begin our seminar series, even though the idea was hatched more than a year ago and the series of seminars were supposed to take place on site. We just had to accept the reality and go on with the second best option. But the upside of convening the series online is we can reach out more and more people from all over the world, while the downside is, of course, there will be no coffee and cookies, and of course no small or big talks with random people during the coffee break and after the event. But let's keep our spirits up. We have a fantastic speaker today, Isa Blumi. So I'm going to introduce him to you. I will need to read this part. Isa is Associate Professor of Turkish and Middle Eastern Studies at Stockholm University Institute for Turkish Studies within the Department of Asian, Middle Eastern and Turkish Studies. He holds a PhD in History and Middle Eastern/Islamic Studies from New York University and a Master of Political Science and Historical Studies from the New School for Social Research at New York. Isa joined Stockholm University in late 2015 after spending the previous decade teaching and researching in universities located in Germany, Belgium, Turkey, the USA, United Arab Emirates, Switzerland, Albania, and Kosovo, which is where he's originally from. Isa researches societies in the throes of social, economic, and political transformation. His latest work covers the late Ottoman period and successor regimes, arguing that these events are part of processes that interlink the Balkans, the Middle East, and the larger Islamic world to arenas traditionally seen beyond the relevance of these regions. In this respect, it's key to explore in a comparative and integrated manner how late and post-Ottoman communities fits into what a global story of transition is. This was explored in his 2012 book, Foundations of Modernity, Human Agency and the Imperial State, and his Ottoman Refugees, 1878-1939, Migration in a Post-Imperial World, which was published in 2013. Isa expands his work to include more of the 20th and 21st centuries, exploring processes of change induced by Muslim and Eastern Christian refugees who ended up settling throughout the world. And he explores the refugees' stories through this global perspective and helps us question how we understand identity and social organization. Beyond his historical research, Isa also regularly writes and lectures on contemporary Balkan and Middle Eastern societies, especially Kosovo, Turkey, and Yemen, and political Islam, most recently reflected in his book titled Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World, which was published in 2018 by University of California Press. He also has published various articles on Islamophobia in Europe and their impact on various communities. So Isa, thank you very much for kindly accepting our invitation one more time. I'm thrilled and looking forward to your talk. So the floor, the microphone, or the exemption or entitlement to unmute is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Indication that you can hear me, someone? Okay, thank you very much. Wonderful introduction. I appreciate the kind words. Wonderful to see Rachel and Ozan and Cansu and Frank, who has now vanished again, and all the colleagues who have been able to dedicate some time to a mass for listening to little old me. I'm going to now very quickly get through our agenda, which is, I think, a very serious one that I have been very much part of my life, in fact, induced by my education, and I stress education, my training at the New School for Social Research by the likes of Charles Tilly and Talal Assad and Aristide Zolberg. I was actually a student at the New School during the throes of transformation, especially in the Balkans, for which I come from, family-wise. Mentally, I had already distanced myself through assimilation to the rest of the world, but I became quite curious as I was exploring theoretically how one understands transition, the power of this institution that was still studied with great earnest and interest in that period of time in the early 90s, the state, and how suddenly we begin to see all kinds of new dynamics at play. The symbolic turning over or bringing down massive statues that had been built over squares that celebrated military victories, regimes that invested heavily in history in their own right, found that their own citizens clearly did not trust, at least at this crucial moment of opportunity, the very histories that they were told, and were in the process of rewriting their own stories. Again, symbolically bringing down statues of representatives of societies to which they were now in the throes of changing. My primary concern at that stage initiated my subsequent career in studying and investing in the kinds of critical analysis of how institutions So that was a bomb, I guess, an invasion from an alien force. Okay.
I think so, yeah. I don't know.
So, in the spirit of free speech and free thought, I will try again with my slides. How we need to invest in and critique the necessary approaches that were indeed heavily invested in transforming our relationship to our past and transforming our relationship with the future. What we envision, in fact, was, and what we can see from our gathering, this I think very legitimate ambition to question how we have understood and how we have written about events in human experience, but more crucially, the dangers that history, as it consistently demonstrated, in the hands of the wrong kinds of institutions, or indeed in the hands of the right kind of institutions, but the wrong people running those institutions. Presumably, social revolutions would now handle or deal with this problem of who was occupying these important institutions that help not only write history, patronize historians, but disseminate this history. My concern is that there's been very little critical engagement for, in fact, what we actually mean by history. So the events of actually trying to rewrite, in many ways, suddenly flattens human complexities. We become those people who are standing in these squares are suddenly yet again submerged in dynamics that account for how hegemons actually organize history in the past. And unfortunately, since the 1990s, clearly new embodiments of hegemony, investment in history writing has demonstrated that once again, we're dealing with the very prescribed enterprise of flattening human experiences to the point where only a narrow definition of what has happened over the course of a history that we have now liberated supposedly from colonial state has resulted in history remaining a tool with the reader's responsibility not really yet engaged in challenging the fundamental epistemologies that shape how we understand our relationship with history. So here I embrace the call from Charles Tilly, one of my professors at the New School, to actually start understanding the products of contentious politics that in some cases invest heavily in narratives of exclusion, direction, and dictation. And becoming aware that it is not meant only to debilitate and induce surrender in readers. Readers are not expected to just completely surrender their autonomy to think to the narrative that is presented to them. That in fact, as readers, we need to as much disengage ourselves and question afresh what is presented to us as revisionist scholarship. So nor is it the invitation to supplement and use a new but all too familiar enterprise of history writing that can actually fulfill our ambitions with this work group that you guys have so wonderfully put together over the course of the next 2 months. Quotes from various actors, including a fiction writer who was a very keen observer of the nature of Cold War and United States culture, clearly interjects and highlights just how history has found itself a fundamental place in an operative way. And we, of course, as faithful readers, sometimes concede the narrative a power to determine and shape our questions that we subsequently raise. This is very important.
Sir, sorry,
Yes.
just not to disturb your narrative, but some of us have lost your PowerPoint. Would you mind terribly sharing your screen again? Or you can carry on without it if you prefer. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't see this?
Not at all.
No. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry, and I didn't want to interrupt because I was following closely, but it might help.
Okay. So do you see my screen now?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, so I don't know where I left off visually, but I'll continue on because we're quickly running out of time. One of the primary interjections in response to what was clearly becoming an important and very necessary trend in post-colonial studies, what we would refer to as post-colonial studies that blossoms in the 1990s, would be those who actually recognized that there was the rudiments of a continuation of a certain kind of relationship, an epistemology of colonialism in its own right, the byproduct of something we would call modernity, in which history as a capital H still functions and has a certain role to play in an enterprise of social engineering, necessarily needs to be undermined. So Robert Young's important contribution in 1990 with writing history and the West through this prism of, he identifies these lingering white mythologies, even with those ideologically self-positioned individuals and groups who were explicitly trying and claiming to reclaim history on behalf of those who had long been abused by this very process. So my concern as we reread by complicating, expanding our resource base, even evacuating for a moment the desire to enter into meta-narratives, to discover parallels, complements, antonyms, and indeed new questions, answers, heretofore erased by the ways we both rewrite and reread history, is a continuation. So it's almost like a never-ending process of us actually challenging the repertoires that often have been programmatically applied to our critiques of essentialist historiography of the past that reinforce the power, the discursive arrangement of Northwestern Atlantic power in, over the course of the 19th and 20th century. And I took heed to Robert Young's very important intervention at this stage and perceived to suggest that a tactic of unreading as in the process of our rewriting, or at least starting to venture into investigations that may prove fruitful in new and different ways, is of course to remember Gramsci's exploration of cultural hegemony. We identify how particular actors in their histories end up necessarily excluding even this identified target or object of rescue, this very patronizing kind of discourse about saving people from history and bringing them back into the discourse necessarily helps continue a marginalization, an erasure of certain kinds of experiences that these people presumably are now allowed to iterate in our narrative. So the scope of marginalization predicated on levels of violence, coercion, location, need not be geographic. The marginalization that we are, I'm hoping for us to reveal, to unread as we analyze our various materials, whether it be ethnographic, whether it be derived from other formats, or indeed archival, that these are in fact epistemological and or discursive acts of violence. The scope of marginalization is in the frames that we use very often, I would say uncritically, to, in theory, bring out new perspectives for the very, I think, again, justified purpose of hearing their stories. But how are we hearing these stories? I'm raising the red flag as I continue to read these interventions from the 1990s onwards. So here is, again, taking Spivak's cue that we are missing an opportunity to iterate what is not said in history when we try to adopt synonyms to integrate otherwise excluded peoples, experiences, moments. So here I extend this to actual more abstract sense. What is going on around a person's life? What is the physicality of that experience? Is often lost in these larger meta-narratives that are dogmatic and framed in ideological terms that are not necessarily getting the point, as Spivak is warning. We run the risk, therefore, of distorting the dynamics that actually write that history if we engage in a project of simply rewriting the subaltern into a new history. How does that play out? How does one actually try to avoid reiterating or reframing and failing to unread experience amongst peoples who are registered or not registered historiographically is something that we should be very careful in thinking about there are dangers, there are pitfalls for what we are actually hoping to accomplish in our various projects. So the quest of being heard and being known is very much an adaptation of certain kinds of knowing, of thought, of reasoning and language that not necessarily represents the immediacy of what people were experiencing and needing at certain points of time over the grid of transformation in these especially dynamic periods of transition, which I, as a historian of this, I'm particularly interested in. So anthropologists, sociologists, they bring this voice into history, and they're often generous offerings of a place inside the confines of history. But again, they're mobilizing tools of analysis that continue to identify the object as abstractions to a certain extent, tools to make larger ideological claims or theoretical projects flesh out in meaningful ways for their audiences. And here I take Joseph Massad's very important interventions and understanding and deconstruction of the violence that liberal epistemologies have brought to our understanding of a number of things that really, especially prior to hegemonic moments in which cultural hegemony, as Gramsci identified, were still not yet possible, or were still awaiting other subsequent contingencies in order for it to be possible. So we talk about Islam in, as again, Talal Asad is even critiqued. We have this sense and notion of religion in a very post-Enlightenment kind of framing, and we immobilize in a very, again, sympathetic manner that end up reducing Muslims, the peoples who live in these areas, as simple targets for liberation via this kind of exercise of rewriting them into history. And this has become quite problematic, and it's manifested, as Joseph Massad has shown in countless times over his work over the years, that it's very, very oppressive for peoples actually being targeted for liberation. So again, Talal Asad had done a wonderful series of studies and challenging the kinds of ways we translate human experiences across vast territories, temporalities, and these experiences of these moments of reacting to dynamics of change on people's lives do not need to be necessarily iterated in the terminology and the framework that is unfortunately what we our tools. These are our tool sets when we learn at university, and this is how we begin to apply and ask our questions about history. And again, we're coming from the right place, but sometimes the results end up being reinforcing of these colonialist epistemologies. So decolonizing history may lead to actually reifying that what functions as crucial. In other words, the tool of empire in the first place, discourse, epistemology, the categories themselves, and how power is realized need not take over the enterprise of writing one's own history. This is the larger question, is that we should not concede, if you will, out of frustration or an inability to move beyond this communicative mode that we have. And I've tried to demonstrate this with a number of books. I try to for instance, in the case of Foundations of Modernity, actually situate the Ottoman Empire's various provincial dynamics that are taking place over the course of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, with withdrawing from the assumption that we actually understood and understand the predetermination of the relationship these people would experience with the modern, so-called modern world. That in fact, modernity itself is not part of the question. It should be left out as we analyze events. The retrospective process of writing into history from the perspective that we have today is often very problematic. We challenge these teleologies. We've done that in our exercises and seminars, but I still am not comfortable with how, especially this crucial corner of the world, the animations that are taking place in so-called isolated, faraway villages in the highlands of Yemen, or on some fishing villages around Kuwait, or in the mountains of Albania, how they either or contribute to this teleology. It still is a function in Ottoman historiography of we're trying to figure out how we get to a certain point in time. And I'm suggesting maybe we look at things that actually don't go anywhere historically. Maybe we look at things that actually end as a kind of an exercise of thought, of thinking, and looking at the documentation that we have and write in a way that actually is not seeking to tie these events to subsequent events. Because subsequent events, in fact, are very much detached from the immediacy of people's actions on the ground in this very contested period, 1870s to World War I. So challenging the logic of occupation stories, unimaginable communities, identify those communities that are unimaginable in the government speak, if you will. The state, the all-seeing state, right? Seeing like the state, as James Scott has suggested that we need to understand and appreciate, limits our ability to actually understand the dynamics that are at play in areas that are still not yet incorporated into this hegemonic frame. That is where history actually intervenes and tells us how we interpret these actions. These actions are actually have very different dynamics at play that need to be considered. Is there someone intervening? I hear some rumbling. Okay, anyways. I do this again with the Balkans in an earlier book, again, challenging the meta-narrative of the inevitability of ethno-nationalism and the arisal of nation states at the cusp of Ottoman administration and the rise of new kinds of positionalities vis-a-vis the larger world, and identify there are a multiplicity of positions that individuals and clusters around these individuals make at various points in time, that they are not permanent. They are actually constantly mobilized and transformed over time. And I do this specifically with a category that becomes increasingly programmatic in how, in our, again, empathetic way of writing people back into history, try to tell the story of the refugee in the context of detrimental conditions, loss, alienation, distress. And I actually argue quite oftenly, I found the dynamics is much more complicated as these human beings reformulate constituencies that often are mobilized by capitalist interests to actually be colonizers. There's this very horrific, sad irony that those whose lives have been disrupted by colonialist enterprises elsewhere in their homelands end up being instruments of similar kinds of capitalist ventures elsewhere. Or not so deviously, they nevertheless become important actors in ways that are often lost if we refer to them and try to explore them entirely through this prism of them being refugees. Migrants is a more kind of positive and proactive variability for these actors in the documentation. And here I'm playing with the confusion that often comes into our analysis of these kinds of zones of contention. That one day you can be distressed and marginalized, and the next day you can actually mature or deconstruct into something quite different. And there is a task there to actually capture this. And here is where I actually intervene in the case of the events in Yemen. So I bring this perspective to how we are trying to understand current events and how we are in many ways also lost in the kinds of logics of analysis that the instruments of empire that induce and apologize, if you will, for violence vetted on mostly a rural people who have been struggling for over a century against the encroachments of global capitalism. Those who are advocating on behalf of Yemenis in various shapes and form are unfortunately trapped by the language from which they are drawing and understanding Yemen in the first place. So I kind of provide interesting vignettes of interesting clashes where there were constant efforts to actually impose these, say, post-Enlightenment Western epistemologies on Yemenis at various points in time, and they constantly proved to be disaffective indeed challenged to the point where the encroachments of global capitalist imperialism were constantly thwarted over the course of the 20th century. This case of Charles Crane, he's the heir of the plumbing fixtures fortune of his family. He's the first one who brought toilets to the Holy Lands. He had a very intimate relationship with a variety of actors in the post-Ottoman world, and he was very keen on working and collaborating with Rockefeller and others to help instrumentalize this esprit of the white man's burden to go and save these heathens. He was also a Christian evangelical, and so he paid a lot of money to a lot of people to go and venture out to find souls to save. At the same time, he wanted to make money selling pipelines and toilets to this sometimes very rich world flooded by water that could also be translated into oil works with his buddy Rockefeller, who was, of course, the quiet CEO of this vast oil empire that becomes known as the Seven Sisters. He hires an engineer who is dispatched by Crane, a guy named Carl Twitchell, who has a very interesting story that extends to the 1940s in this larger theater of the Arabian Peninsula. And what I'm trying to suggest is that these agents of empire, these agents of capital, find themselves often perplexed and ultimately disengaged from their immediate enterprise and are actually forced by contingency to reanimate their place in this larger complex trajectory, if you will, this inevitability of American hegemony, the inevitability of the oil economy that we now think of the Middle East almost exclusively. This Twitchell is also basically suspected of spying in he's doing too many detailed analyses of wells, of looking at very closely at seemingly strategic areas in northern Yemen. The Imam throws him out. We are not subservient to the dollar. We don't want your aid. We don't want your development. A very interesting use of language you can see in the documentation, and Twitchell is actually thrown out. Ironically enough, he will use this as an opportunity to provide the kind of intelligence that Ibn Saud, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, would need in order to conquer these areas you can see in the southwest parts of Arabia that will eventually in 1934 become part of Saudi Arabia. He actually provides the groundworks, if you will, for a military invasion in precisely the areas that Imam Yahya and his people actually understood him to be doing that, spying, keeping notes, providing kind of intelligence. So it is a sad irony that a very productive part of Yemen is going to be lost because of this guy who was recognized rightfully as a spy, a corporate spy, who was more than willing then to become the servant of this new enterprise called the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And the result would be a dramatic transformation. But again, it's not likely to have happened in such a way if these other kinds of immediate interjections took place in other parts of the region. And so we want to dissociate as well as connect in odd ways things that are otherwise lost in our meta-narratives about Yemen stuck in the Middle East in the throes of the Cold War or in the throes now of this global campaign to fight terrorism or whatever it is that the narrative is about these days. So we have now a new enterprise emerging, oddly enough, as a result of the failed enterprise somewhere else. Because in fact, as Twitchell goes along and provides the same kind of services that leads to Saudi expansion at the expense of Kuwait, at the expense of Bahrain, at the expense of Qatar and Abu Dhabi, you have the enterprise of Rockefeller's oil empire really playing itself out in the most important prize, it turns out, Saudi Arabia's eastern coast, which was all up for grabs at this time when Twitchell comes for the first time. And I fast forward this for the purposes of, again, stressing points that are often missed because of our ideological embrace of images that are compliant with our meta-narratives about, for instance, the Cold War and Third World resistance. We have become subservient to, for instance, the image of Abdul Nasser as being the kind of spokesperson for an esprit of resistance that extended the entire Third World, this kind of movement in the global South, this non-alignment movement that supposedly Nasser was one of the 4 or 5 heads of. The interesting irony is that the son of this very same Imam Yahya who threw out Twitchell in the 1920s, his his son Imam Ahmed, to the man to the left, supposedly a backward, evil, medieval ruler who ruled over his minions like a cruel king, was a very progressive man, in fact. They actually were actively involved in the anti-Zionist project. They were actively involved in the idea of pan-Arabism, pan-Islamism, and they were the founding coalition with Egypt to form what became eventually the United Arab Republic. And until 1961, Egypt, the northern Yemen's imamate, were very close allies. In fact, the imamate had very close relationships with the Swedes, close relationships with Maoist China, with the Soviet Union, with Czechoslovakia, and any other country, in fact, even the United States, were vying for this supposedly backward, impoverished little corner of the Arabian Peninsula. Indeed, the only sovereign, independent zone in all the Islamic world at this time. Quite interesting. It emerges that Egypt, by the time of 1962, Nasser has gotten into the bed with the new president of the United States, Kennedy, and in many ways, the process dramatically changes with the invasion of Yemen, the violent war as a response until 1970, and the United Arab Republic had lasted only 3 years, 58 to 61, with only Syria joining Egypt because of these shenanigans. The final point I want to make about all this is that you also begin to see the consequences of this is that in Yemen, you find continuous capacity, even after the destruction of the imamate. You have farmers able to coalesce in ways that are not necessarily articulated in Marxist-Leninist critiques of global capitalism or factory agriculture, but they certainly did not like what the Americans were offering by the mid-1970s. And they collectivized and created institutions that were local, that were impervious to the kinds of pressures and the global institutions that the Americans and Nasser during his occupation period actually introduced into northern Yemen through force. So you have this back and forth in the archives, the frustrations that the USAID and Peace Corps elements, the intellectual class, the anthropologists who were writing their PhDs and given money by various funding agencies to go literally to do what Twitchell was doing, spying on these Yemenis, to somehow give some kind of feedback of the human resources that were constantly, in a frustrating way, resisting the inevitability of economic growth, the recovery of livelihoods, the introduction of modernization, aka drawing from Daniel Lerner and others, that was very au courant in the 50s and 60s in the Cold War context. So we can rewrite by unreading what we are taught and understand to be Yemen. We actually need to go back to the process of discovery with the hope of not actually finding something that would fit programmatically into a countercultural, post-colonialist kind of a narrative that has become embedded in how we study these themes. But maybe actually we can, like Charles Tilly was suggesting, don't embrace my theory as a working model and that you have to find complements to it. Find something new. Discover that, in fact, there's a dynamic that actually warrants distinctively ways of writing about them. And so I found in the case of throughout the century, in a place like Yemen, you find remarkable periods of reconstitution of people's lives, organizing in ways that are collectively or individually resisting at certain points in time various forces of modernization, of modernity, of global capitalism, and of the kind of retorts that are coming from the Marxist-Leninist perspective as well. And you end up having this very dynamic society that is only recently positioned to be identified as a simply poor country that needs to be saved. Where in fact, if you actually are someone who is interested in the geology of these areas and make calculations, these realpolitik kind of references that Kissinger was always referring to, Yemen is not a poor country. And of course, this is one way we can always identify why Yemen is so strategically important. There's huge amounts of gas and oil on land and offshore that have not yet been tapped into. But that's only telling part of the story, because the destruction of Yemen is necessary because of the capacity of peoples to constantly not confide and be appropriated and embrace these meta-narratives of history that yes, some Yemenis would go to universities in the West or in Moscow and come back and do their duty. But so many other Yemenis just were not permitting this kind of exchange. So that we actually have a very different kind of narrative, which is impossible to translate using the languages that we have and mobilize when we are purposely trying to unsettle history and rewrite history. That's my suggestion, that Yemen, in fact, can provide us this kind of case study and justification for my seemingly uncooperative interjection here, that maybe we are still not fully embracing and recognizing that we are facing serious problems when we try to mobilize liberation in certain ways. We end up becoming self-orientalized agents, as Chatterjee at one point suggested. And indeed, you can find that in many of the cases that I look at in these books that I share with you. But there are also a plethora of cases that actually did not subscribe. And in fact, this is why they are not represented in history, because they don't fit the necessary categories that, for whatever reason, we're not able to fully deconstruct as of yet. So I think I've reached my 30-minute limit. Hopefully I didn't scream your ears out. I am done. I'm very grateful for your patience, those of you who are still listening. And I would love to hear any responses or critiques. Rachel or Ozan?
Yeah, everybody who signed up is still here, so I think I think your talk was very interesting and enthusiastic. I have a lot of questions. People who have questions and have downloaded the app can put those in the chat, or they can send an email to our decolonization email address. I think Ozan also has a few questions, so I'm going to give him the floor first, and then we will take questions from the general audience, including myself, hopefully. Ozan?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Isa, first of all, for this thought-provoking talk. I very much like your position on epistemological violence and postulation also, where you say we need to invest in rereading history, equipping ourselves with new questions. I agree that we need conscientious, morally aware and critical engagement with current historical writing, and heedful reading of what we may call Euro or West-centric literature is also needed as a dependable pathway to undermining such literature, exposing its inner dynamics and crevices and so on. And as an optimist, I will say that there is a greater demand now than before for reading materials, especially that demonstrate how the imperial past and present, histories of domination, difference, inclusion and exclusion, have affected the nature and quality of disciplines, including history or security studies, which is kind of my field, anthropology, what have you. So there is demand for interrogating genealogies of hierarchies, how these histories generated and informed the everlasting patterns of hierarchies inherited to us, hierarchies through economic and financial exploitation, which you briefly mentioned when you were talking about this oil potential of the Middle East, by way of definition of peoples from the deck of ships or at the metropoles, and their administration through, again, this Orientalist or civilizationist or white-centered categorizations, and hierarchies that we inhabit as a result of the production, reproduction, and dissemination of imperially oriented knowledge to this day. And Isa's book on Foundations of Modernity is a great example of such a critical reading. Today, another wonderful research project is carried out at Amsterdam and Utrecht by Remco Raben, who is a key member of our decolonization group. They ask a straightforward and powerful, sophisticated question: what happens to knowledge during colonization, with colonization? And they raise this question with reference to the Indonesian experience, looking at different sectors, technology, science. So I will quickly move to my question. If we may think if you may try to think more globally, maybe a first question that a historian might have in mind, parallels what Remco and his research team are doing. What was the history or historical knowledge with decolonization or de-imperialization, given that colonialism was an not as overt, explicit endeavor in politics like the Russian, Chinese, and Ottoman empires? In the limited time you have skillfully disclosed your experience as a historian of late Ottoman Empire, bridging it with contemporary Middle East in the 1870s, with the destruction of Yemen today. But could you share a bit more of your insights into how we can do it further? And the other question, the main question that I would like to ask to get this discussion started, takes a bit more critical distance from your lecture. I just wonder, Lisa, what, in your view, are some of the obstacles on the way to rereading, as you suggest, unsettling and rewriting history? What stands before us in attempts to realize the transition from the reconstruction of imperial epistemologies, and by extension their narratives, theories, and concepts, to a less flattened, to quote you, and more complex set of non-violent epistemologies? Or how, in your view, can we overcome them and promote critical engagement with histories of empire and their sometimes invisible imprints in scholarly disciplines? I know these are all very big questions, possibly with long answers. I'm asking them, to be honest, just to fill the discussion. Please feel free to ignore some of them. And again, thank you very much for your brilliant lecture.
Oh, you're very kind. Am I answering, or am I waiting for other questions? Frank?
I think you can answer Ozan immediately, and then we'll take questions 2 or 3 at a time.
Okay, Ozan, I'll answer your second question in maybe a flippant way, but I think it's quite indicative of some of the pitfalls and dangers that await those of us who are trying to change canon, or trying to re-engineer or reorientate ourselves to new kinds of perspectives. Finding a job. You may run into the problem of you're too radical. You don't fit into a certain kind of, and now I'm not referring to the old entrenched white man dominated departments either. I'm talking about ideologically reorientated departments that have as an agenda a certain kind of trajectory, an idea of what post-colonial thought should look like. And I find some of the biggest intolerance coming from people who are, in theory, we're on the right side, but I find a great deal of resistance to challenging, in very petty ways, some of the narratives that I find a little bit problematic in how they translate documentation produced in certain contexts to an enterprise of decolonizing history, for instance. So that's some way reading against the archival grain, as Anne Stoller from the New School anthropologist, an historical anthropologist, evokes in her title, I think is a good way for us to be conscious of the kinds of insights that doesn't necessarily serve the project, the meta project that often comes with this quite grandiose claim that we're making here, that sometimes the intricacies of a moment that ends up really not meaning anything to your larger story, actually in increments studied along those lines, in the sensibility of an ethnographer. As an anthropologist, they're often giving you and providing you the experiences of 3 or 4 people to then start analyzing and positioning these experiences in a larger narrative. That could be an interesting an approach to how we write history. It's a micro-historical kind of perspective, going back to local histories, yes, but also doing comparative ones, something that I tried to do, something that I was inspired at the New School to do, looking at Latin American studies and borderland studies, which does this in brilliant ways in different geographic contexts, but sometimes gets lost when it's reanimated or appropriated by scholars who don't spend the time actually reading the debates about the the genealogies of this in these kinds of interventions. So you end up having this crass kind of reference, borderline studies, the common textbook, and then it's doing the work for you. Where in fact, as historians looking at archival material, sometimes very rich and detailed material you can find out there, if we can ever go back to the archives again, is there for us to do the work as Anne Stoller does in her various books about Dutch Indonesia, for instance. Finding the nuances and the intimacies and the complexities of people's life in the colonies. Situating at the center, yes, the colonialist family, but that family is rift with confusion and dangers. My microphone is too loud. Okay. Complexities that immediately translate to relationship with indigenous interlocutors at the local setting and in that regional setting, whether in Sumatra farmlands or in the market, the central market in Jakarta, as they're trying to now venture out and survive the economic shifts and balances in the global economy. These are all opportunities, I think, to, one, tell stories that go nowhere, and by comparison and looking at these intricacies that give us insight into these contexts that don't really mean anything in our global story, our larger story, which is instrumental to pushing an ideological agenda, but they can actually become quite fruitful if worked with and explored and engaged with other scholars. This is so important to actually have this possibility of work groups, of reading each other's work, getting feedback from others, but reading beyond your immediate areas of, if it's area studies or if it's your own discipline or your school of thought within the discipline. And that's the dangers, that departments are still designed along the lines of faculty deciding, well, we don't want somebody who challenges our methodological kind of orientation. I don't think the departments are diverse yet enough. Maybe physically, if we play along racial lines, yes, we're becoming more diverse along sexual lines. There are more women, alhamdulillah, in the academy. But is that does that necessarily translate into how we actually, as a community in the department or as a community in the larger town around the university, actually figuring out ways to write differently, to read differently, maybe to stop reading and to think beyond the confines of what has already been written. Be creative. These are all suggestions, and again, I've learned so much from reading the scholarship from other parts of the world that seemingly had nothing to say or contribute to my narrow areas of the Balkans and the Gulf and Southern Arabia. And I would hope to have contributed to their ways of understanding borderlands and the commodification of nature and all the other things that I'm looking at now. But alas, I don't reach many people with my work. So maybe for a reason, maybe I'm not coherent or I'm just stupid. I don't know. Thank you.
I don't think that's necessarily true. No, I think you explore very interesting avenues of research. I have a few questions. I'm gonna abuse my position. I'm gonna ask my question. If anybody else wants to ask a question and hasn't put it in the chat or send an email, you can also alternatively wave your hand, and then you can ask a question as well. This has been done in the past as well. So I was wondering, Isa, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Also because you seem to explore sort of under-researched areas that actually can shed a lot of light on how we think about sort of colonialism, decolonization more globally. I'm just wondering, I was struck by your comment about modernity. You seem, and please elaborate on this, right? You sort of seem to suggest that decolonizing history means that we have to write stories that are anti-capitalist and anti-modern or non-modern. While I'm just struck by that observation, because in my own research I look at Pan-Africanism, and my whole argument is that Pan-Africanism is an alternative road to modernity. that has, it's a particular brand of modernity. Pan-African leaders were more than willing to compete with capitalists, communists, imperialists, to sort of project their own ideas abroad. So I'm just wondering, how do you see that relationship? Does decolonizing history necessarily mean that we have to write stories of non-modernity, as you seem to suggest?
I would suggest that there are many of the intelligentsia out there who actually did not subscribe to the, let's say, tool set to analyze and understand their realities, their worlds, their trajectories, their possibilities, being narrowly confined by this discourse of modernity and the assumptions that what actually constitutes modernity in the process where the ultimate endpoint was a disaster for many societies that became taken over by a technocratic class educated in a very pejorative way in Moscow or in Harvard. We still have to deal with these problems, these neoliberals who are running around. It's not a project necessarily to discredit commerce and discredit market forces, and as if they're not part of the human story over the course of millennia. That would be, again, a very disingenuous attempt to rewrite history to serve as an ideological project, which is not reflective of the very reasons why people mobilized in the heart of industrial capitalism in certain ways and embraced certain kinds of readings of their relationship to capital and to each other. We need to disentangle the projects of Pan-Africanists, Pan-Arabists, Pan-Islamicists who are mobilizing language and frames of understanding their immediate realities of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were not into the task. They were not invested to critique the very positionality that is assumed by projecting their future society, their ideal post-colonial society in ways that would many ways reinforces the relationship those societies historically as well as in the future had with the larger world. I mean, think about those societies that spent enormous amounts of time trying to destroy the elements in order to create that idealized modern society. It did entail necessarily lots of violence. I'm not going to sit here and say that de facto any enterprise to transform societies in these ways were counter-revolutionary, or certainly the revolutions of the 1990s and the springs of the Arab world have been co-opted and animated by actors who were heavily invested in by powerful interests. The neoliberal enterprise has co-opted, as Joseph Massad says very clearly, that we're dealing with liberal secularists who are now commanding the discourse about what the Arab Spring was all about. Just like with what happened in the United States with Trump, that now we're associating people's distress and fury and fear about the transformations in the United States, the lives that have been destroyed over the process of the last 20 years. And it's translated into this narrow kind of definition of, well, everyone is dismissed as white supremacist, which is very problematic and unproductive, I see. And so I would encourage you to question Frantz Fanon and I mean, look at the kind of projection and what was necessary to actually become an effective revolution. What was necessary to do? Look at the disasters that resulted in many places and why these were disasters. These are not just simply people bowing down and letting their heads be chopped off or forced to work in the fields of Pol Pot's Cambodia, a very Maoist project, by the way. There was coercion, there was violence, there was resistance, and not just amongst bourgeois class. There were also people's lives in the countryside that were uprooted. Very fascinating now. These coalitions between these so-called rival globalist projects from the Soviet Union, from Maoist China, from even Albania, Enver Hoxha's third way after the 1960s. And, of course, the project that came from the North Atlantic world, the so-called globalization process that was really able to be unleashed with Jeffrey Sachs and others pillaging Russia after the early 1990s. But that there was these interactions that probably, I would think, animated the extent of why violence was necessary in post-colonial societies and why they was not so easily transformed into a successful enterprise. Certainly there was interjections from the outside. Certainly there would be constant counter-revolutionary guerrilla movements established. But if you look at the resistance against Portuguese colonialism, they were so fraught with divisions. They were murdering each other in Cairo. These was a global struggle for power and influence. The struggle to make someone a revolutionary or a revolutionary group relevant to potential advisors, to new supplies of revenue, new supplies of and members to make the party more relevant. These are interesting enterprises that demand micro-handling them. The very idea of Pan-Africa is very suspect. And if it would be taught in a history book, we would critique it as very, very problematic. And the very embrace of these ideas that we can holistically impose a kind of ethos of shared collective. This is a geography entirely created from the finance capitalist universe created from the 18th century onwards. It's a very odd way of looking at your world and your neighbors and understanding your history, whatever you think you are at this stage. It's very much a reflection of their times. And I'm suggesting not everyone, just as we saw in North Yemen, not everyone understood it in those terms. The Imam of North Yemen was against Zionism. He was against colonialism. He was against capitalism, corporate capitalism. And on principle, he joined with players who did not have the same kind of ideological orientation because the project was one of very specific terms. The moment that project started fragmenting and you had Egypt that had the ambitions to do something else with their newfound popularity and power and influence, making partnership with this new president named Kennedy, that relationship changed. And then subsequently, unfortunately for Yemen, a horrible war would last for 8 years. And many repetitions, whether it be in Mozambique, Angola, my goodness, and all of these so-called Rhodesias, North, South, Congo, whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So do I take away from your response that decolonizing history is also about appreciating appreciating more sort of the particularist visions that exist within a lot of different societies rather than focusing on these big narratives? Would that be a fair characterization?
I think that would be a fruitful way to approaching this. We can go study the party's papers as it's archived and saved in Luanda. Right. Or Tirana. But I can assure you, I've written stuff about the evolution of the Enver Hoxha state and how very frequently it reorientated itself, it pivoted to different international interactions, and it was a very violent process internally. And you can't capture that without being sensitive to very distinctive processes happening in these territories that will become subsumed in this anti-colonial guerrilla conflict, right. For instance, as an example.
Okay, thank you so much. I have another question by Catherine. I don't have a last name, so I'm going to use Catherine if that's okay. She asks a very poignant question about historians and the use of sources. So she says, how do we go about decolonizing history when the sources we use are often based in colonial archives or often colonial sources, and a lot of the material that actually could help us construct decolonial narratives are actually destroyed. Right? How do we deal with that methodological problem?
Yeah, I fully agree. I wouldn't. Yes, go ahead, Frank. Sorry.
No, I think one of the best examples of this, to make this a little bit more poignant for people who don't know, is the destruction of Foreign Office archives, for instance, of the Mau Mau uprising. The Foreign Office sort of hid and destroyed a lot of the documents that could have actually exposed or given us the voice of people who were subjected by colonial rule. Leopold II burned documents that actually could have given us much more information about the Congo Free State, including narratives or voices from people who were subjected. So how do we go about, as historians, and Catherine asks this question, which is very interesting, how do we go about addressing that methodological issue? Particularly in light of what you just said, which is write particularist histories that aren't about the meta and aren't about empire necessarily.
I fully concur and share your angst about not only what has happened to archives, but what is happening to our materials as we speak. There is now, since the 1990s, a very concerted effort to destroy heritage. Certainly in what we call the Middle East, West Asia, with this very suspicious correlation between Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and the destruction of Islamic heritage, especially of a heritage that depicts cultural, ethnic diversity in Syria, Iraq, other parts, and certainly Yemen. It certainly is part and parcel of, historically, a campaign to destroy the evidence of others, right? Cities are bulldozed down. The Americans and their bombers have been notorious for doing that, and there certainly gets the rightful accusations and finger pointing. But the politics of archives is prevalent everywhere. I mean, my mother was just now sorting out letters from her lifetime. She grew up in Eastern Europe, and she has so many things that are so valuable. And I begged her to don't throw that stuff out. You don't understand and appreciate what I could possibly find valuable from that. And then people, of course, are called hoarders. And then, we don't need all this paper. And the dynamic that is at play now, digitizing archives, for me, is very dangerous because it gives the archivists and the propagandists and the screeners yet one more opportunity to go file by file and see what could be possibly damaging. What we have some hope with in this regard is that these colonialist papers sometimes are incredibly detailed, and they often are very inclusive and organized in ways where they call kind of increments or moments. There could be a case that is actually archived collectively, and you have the respective documents that are circulating around, not only, let's say, in Batavia, but also in the outer provinces in Holland itself, and maybe in consulates throughout Southeast Asia. And so we are fortunate to have these kinds of documents. Now, what ultimately is going to happen? I can see in the near future some technocrat who is expected to find ways to save money to outsource the process of preserving archives, outsource the process of digitizing archives, and we're going to see a plundering of heritage in this regard. Regardless if it's an ugly story, regardless if it's from the perspective of some actor on the ground, they are still nevertheless often, they're not robots. They're responding to conditions that are affecting their careers, affecting their relationship to their wife back home. Again, this is what Anne Stoller was doing with her various works on Dutch Indonesia. And I highly subscribe to this enterprise of looking for subtleties and even what seems to be mundane documents. There's all kinds of things coming out. I mean, just imagine, try to position and look for keys of boredom, of concerns with time consumption, moments of budgetary issues that may inflict on how the actual archive is, how the document is written, modifications in how it's presented, and ultimately as a report that goes back to Amsterdam. As an example, again, there are all kinds of things that we can still do to identify tensions, fissures, even if it is not explicitly giving us access to the voice of those who are being tortured or those who are in the jungles fighting Dutch plantation owners. Maybe they do. Sometimes they're interrogated. Sometimes we are lucky enough to be witness to these horrible events where intelligence is gathered. But this is what we're left with. Be creative, especially in more recent times. Seek out new kinds of resources that are not necessarily assumed to be in archives. Archives are not our only place to look for these things. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the past, especially in places like Yemen, many of these people sent by USAID or the UN to do work as anthropologists, they stumbled upon these huge cache of private papers, and they would then hoard them for their own interests. I wouldn't say Brinkley Mesick was doing that. He's also a very good historical anthropologist, works on Yemen. But others have been notorious for deciding on the spot what is interesting, what is important. The rest goes to the garbage. And this is, our only story now is to intervene for the now and the future, to protect our archives. Because believe me, the privatization of archives, it's a profession already, but it's to become now a corporate enterprise, and then we're really up shit creek, if I may use this language.
I'm gonna make a bumper sticker out of it. Thank you so much. We have questions coming in. So I have the next question. So Eva has a comment. Eva Schaalbroek, who's a colleague of us at the UU, about how a lot of the interesting documents are actually also in archives to which we already have access to, such as the Belgian colonial archives, which are full of mold, which is a very interesting observation. We do have a question from Wouter. Wouter, do you want to ask the question yourself? Yes, go ahead. No? Okay, if that's okay, I'll paraphrase what you're saying. So Wouter de Jong has a very interesting question. So he says, in colonial history, European discoveries are the central plot to much historiographies. Is it possible to write an accurate and nuanced world history as long as we keep to this sort of division between the old world and the new world? Is it possible at all as long as there are any narratives starring a particular region? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think Wouter touches upon a very interesting point. If we keep thinking about this in sort of binaries of old world and new world, does that help us with writing decolonial histories? Correct me if I'm wrong, Wouter, in the chat. Please do.
Okay. So yes, very important question, much more in terms of pedagogical questions, because students are so entrapped by these binaries, right? And they certainly pick that up in high school and middle school, and more importantly through mass media. And this is where we're always going to be fighting and swimming upriver and fighting against the tide. And it's just going to get worse because the pervasiveness of this corporatization of education, the streamlining will lead to schools being taught, lessons being taught by one guy or one woman to all of Holland at some point in the near future. And we're all going to be without work, unfortunately, unless we unionize and think forward very quickly. But I was just teaching this lesson today, putting in the context the fact that what is the rationale for these bankrupt plunderers of Andalusia that have now spoiled their capture of the richest corner of Europe, and now we're desperately trying to find new ways to generate revenue. The Portuguese venture out, invest in ships, and send the flotilla around Africa, find their way in the Indian Ocean, and for some 50 years are more or less reapplying their strategies as was applied in the Reconquista, but increasingly adapted to the extent that if you look at Giancarlo Casale's article, which I taught today, for instance, the Ottomans have a very intimate and very complicated relationship with the Indian Ocean by the 1530s. They have recaptured, or they have captured Mamluk Egypt, integrated Mecca, Medina. They're now moving towards Yemen. And so they're heavily invested in now at least some of the bureaucrats in the Ottoman Empire's inner circle of policymakers to invest in expanding, to capturing the trade that has now been disrupted by the arrival of these Portuguese who established Estado de India and have this ambition to become monopolistic. But cannot, because there is still need for partnerships. And Casale demonstrates very brilliantly how in the Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz is colonized by the Portuguese. The fortress governor there is doing direct trade with Basra, an Ottoman port that is facilitating trade just in the Gulf. On the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, Portuguese and the Ottomans are at loggerheads and actually blowing each other's ships up over the fight over the Horn of Africa. We know that Portugal ends up in highlands of Ethiopia, set up the Gondar complex. That lasts for another 50, 60 years before the Dutch and the Danes and the others make their presence in the larger Indian Ocean world. And then, so that's the pretext for exploration, right? These European states have missed the opportunity yet again to learn from the Mediterranean world, to integrate in a relatively peaceful way, because of factors that I keep insisting is predicated on the volatility of their polities. They have to produce revenue. And Europe is being impoverished yet again because of their consumption habits. Hello, Kitty. Spain discovers the Americas. In theory, the Atlantic trade, which then blossoms and creates huge amounts of transfer of wealth from Central America and South America to Spain in the form of bullion, where does it go? It goes into banks who had lent money for that enterprise in the first place, but it also goes to buy more commodities from Asia. So that huge transfer of money that we're talking about, of gold and silver from the Americas, ends up in China and India anyways. That should reorientate a little bit our thinking about the consequences of discovery. That should reorientate our geographies a little bit to think about the nature of the relationship that is complex. It is reactive. It is proactive. It's predicated on what actually takes place in very different dynamics. So you don't have one single Portuguese policy in the Indian Ocean. You actually have, if you actually spend time looking at the documentation, very, very nuanced and different things that have time frames of maybe 1 month or 3 years. And that's where we can actually tap into the complexities of these relationships. And if we stick to a global history that out of necessity to teach kids who don't know otherwise, looking at them as blocks, as hemispheres, as new worlds and old worlds, that is obviously not very helpful. How can you disrupt that? Bring things that I would think is accessible to students. If you frame it in ways and learn how to communicate to them in ways that, interesting, give them cases. High school students is more difficult, but you guys, most of you are teaching at the university. In theory, you should be able to have students who actually read semi-sophisticated arguments and presentations of very, very different counter-narratives to the more general terms of global history that have been imposed and reflective of this North Atlantic universe that has become the claimant to progress, modernity, and the future. That's my answer to Walter. Walter? Nice to meet you.
So I don't necessarily know why some of you I cannot unmute. I think it might have to do with the with the app, having the app or not. So in lieu of having people speak up, I have to look at the chat. I have another question by Rebecca Shepard, who talks about our definition of history. So she says, you mentioned historical anthropology, but what about the anthropology of history? So, how do we, is it, if we have to rethink sources, as you indicated before, if we have to rethink, micro, macro histories, right? How do we then sort of think about history as a craft and then the people who do history? And she particularly stresses maybe the potential for interdisciplinarity, so anthropology and history. Would that be a way forward? Writing an anthropology of history as a craft and the historian? Please correct me if I'm wrong, Rebecca. And I have other questions as well. I have two other questions as well. So.
Just very briefly, absolutely. But could you imagine a history department in Europe allowing ethnographers to come and say, I'm going to do observation here for the next 6 months, and I'm going to write about you guys and girls, you men and women, about your debates, about your pettiness, about the little things that goes on in a history department. That the vast majority of the things you do actually has nothing to do with your craft that you've been hired to supposedly do. And maybe give us reflections, allows us historians to have a voice finally and complain about the administration that has taken over the academic life in Europe and in North America. The corporatization of education maybe has an interesting human voice to it now. If we have the audacious young anthropologists coming to a history in Utrecht and saying, just let me be a quiet observer now for the next 6 months. Let me interview each of you individually. Would you guys have the guts to accept that? Would you like to be studied in this way? I mean, the
Rachel just termed this the worst or best reality TV show in the world.
Okay. Right. Well, we are all very curious, right? We've been trained to watch this media phenomena of looking into people's personal day-to-day tragedies and dramas, right? I think they should do a reality show of a history department. I don't think that you would have any students left after the parents would say, no way, you're going to go into that department.
Your words, Eliza, not mine.
Not your department, correct. But I'm just saying, in kind of a general observation of someone who's been for 25 years having to navigate the politics of adults who still act like children sometimes.
So I'm really intrigued by this conversation. I think we've raised sort of the issue with sources, issues with positionality, issues with the historian as an anthropological subject. But Eva Schalbroek in the chat also raises a fundamental question about the act of decolonizing. So she says, how to decolonize old white colonial men beyond writing that you are complicating them, right? So does complicating a narrative, is that the same as decolonizing a narrative?
I would say so, because, again, as was warned by Robert Young and many others who critiqued the kind of liberal enterprise that often corresponds with rewriting history, is that we end up mobilizing the same kind of frameworks to understand the decolonization process. The critiques of colonialism often comes from some of the same epistemological foundations, and this is problematic for some. I would say it's problematic because it leads us to logics that make it difficult to interpret things differently. Decolonization is a dynamic that, unfortunately, in many cases, as we know, especially in Francophone Afrique or much of Latin America, this is you may have decolonization at the formal level. There may be independence, but there's still very integrated, complicated relationships to global capital, to other dynamics that clearly have not been severed. Very few enterprises have successfully segregated and separated themselves from the larger world, right? Is that in fact something that people want is another question. But the process of decolonization has to account for the fact that decolonization is not complete. In the framing of the whole process itself, how the history of this decolonization struggle has been written, and how it's mobilized, and how it's now being challenged by a new generation. And the reflections, of course, is all based on what has happened in Algeria over the last 30 years, what has happened in South Yemen or in Kenya. And of course, the students of empire and imperialism and decolonization from Mombasa are going to have a very different story to tell now than let's say their grandfathers or fathers even, who were writing at the time of this process. Their investments are very different. And that should be accounted for also, and encouraged and engaged and analyzing it, I think. But it's fraught with complications, and as long as we don't recognize the lingering, it's like a PCR test, that captures dead corona molecules in the nose. This is what we end up having. We have colonialism and white mythologies throughout the way we're writing history, as Robert Young phrased in his very important 1990 book. If you have not read it, Catherine, I would suggest that you take a look at it, because it's very, very indicative of a man who's trained in comparative literature, in the theory of decolonization, of the violence of this process of writing history, and he's old enough to actually I'm old enough also to remember my career starts in the 80s, writing and thinking about these things, reflecting on the end of the so-called second world in the 1990s. So that has, I think, an important also personal impact on how we think about things. I'm not suggesting that young people have nothing to say about this. They will certainly come at it very differently, but think about what is influencing your framing of questions. look at the epistemological kind of roots of your learning, of why you think about what your enterprise is really expected to do. Constantly critique. I mean, this is Althusser 101, whom I evoke a lot in my work. I think his interventions in challenging the ideological state apparatus and how ideology functions and how we think about history was very, very innovative and important. And of course, it started that whole trajectory from Foucault to Derrida and others.
Yes, definitely.
Frank, I'm sure you're aware of time. It's 2 minutes to 5.
Yes.
And also, I would encourage everybody to look at the chat because there's some marvelous parallels and resonances and comments there, and really building of knowledge together. It's wonderful.
Wonderful. I'm sorry, I don't see it. Is it possible to save it and then send it to me, Frank?
I will.
Thank you, and thank you.
So, are there any other? Does anybody still have a last question? Because we are at time, and I do understand people need to, do other things. All right. Well, if that's okay, Rachel, I will close it down here. Thank you so much, Isa, for wanting to do this. Our very, very first inaugural speaker in our lecture series, with almost 50 participants, more than 50 participants, and still a very lively discussion now. I think you have done very well, and we collectively have learned a lot. Thank you so much. I will encourage all of you to join us for our next event, which will be in a month. I don't know the exact date. Can anybody jump in? No. Our next meeting it's all posted online. So I urge you to. Sorry.
It's not a month. It's next week actually.
It's next week. Yes, true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, our intern. Yes. Oh, there, Allison. Of course. Yes, Allison will be talking about unsettling law, legal theory, and how the decolonization of law and legal theory and legal scholarship can help us sort of better understand the world we live in today. So, looking forward to that already. Thank you so much. Isa, I'm seeing you cannot see it in the chat, but people are profusely thanking you for your time. So with that, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I hope to see you all of you next week. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening. Ciao.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you all.